This is Andrew Whitstadt, and you are listening to Heavy Board. And we're recording this on November 22nd, 2025. My guest today is Mark Perez. Mark is a professor of ethics at Johnson & Wales University. He founded the Charlotte Center for the Humanities and Civic Imagination. He created the Charlotte Ideas Festival, and he launched the Forum Speaker Series, which brings big and even unorthodox ideas to the public. And on top of all that, listeners, Mark is also a writer. His debut book was a work of memoir titled The Man Who Lived 100 Lives, about his father's life and Mark's own coming of age. And his debut novel was released just this year, titled The Accord, a speculative thriller novel about the current beginnings of the AI revolution and what it might look like in the not-so-distant future. No stranger to the world of podcasts, Mark hosted the On Life and Meaning podcast for 3 years, where he interviewed guests about, you guessed it, life and meaning. Topics we are very interested in on this podcast, as many listeners will know. Mark Perez, thank you so much for coming on Heavy Board.
It's great to be here, Andrew.
Fantastic. All right. First question we like to ask everybody is, what was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? How did these early years start to form Mark in this way?
It's a long story, Andrew, and we'll try to make it as short as possible, but it was quite an interesting and stimulating childhood growing up. The short way to introduce that is that we moved 20 times in 20 years across cities, states, and countries. And during that period of time, we had ups and downs and a variety of different influences that have made me the person I am today. My parents were immigrants to this country from Brazil. My dad was an intellectual philosopher, historian who found himself in sales of a variety of different goods and services as an independent business person. And he did a lot of import-export between Brazil and the United States, which led him to move us as a family across different port cities, from New York to San Francisco, to Miami, to New Orleans, to Rio de Janeiro. And because his business often had good times and difficult times, we often moved neighborhoods as we were sometimes in better financial situations and sometimes not. So, and my mom was a housewife during this period of time, but she was a person who was very much into art and music and appreciating culture, especially her own culture from her native land, Brazil. So I was born in San Francisco, California, but only stayed there for 2 years as a child before moving to New York. And my earliest years were in Queens, New York, working class neighborhood, moving often 3 times just in the few years that I was there as a child, from one neighborhood to the next. From there, we moved to Rio de Janeiro, and I lived there for 2 years, and then to Miami. And in Miami, we moved frequently as well. And in between, we actually moved back to San Francisco at least one time. So we moved frequently. I was one of 5 children. I was the youngest child. And so grew up with more of that room to run that the youngest have to be creative and artistic, whereas my older brother was more traditionally responsible. So all of those, as you can imagine, sequencing that happens in family order. And then I have 3 sisters as well.
That's fantastic. And no, please go on. Please go on.
Yeah. So I think between moving frequently and my parents' influences, I became attracted to books. Books were my friend growing up. Since I was moving from one school system to the next every year or two, very rarely did I have lifelong friends or a stable community growing up. So I got attracted to reading and writing and storytelling at a young age. My dad was a terrific storyteller, traditional mid-century, 20th century kind of fellow who could tell stories well into the night. So I think all those things influenced me. Uh, and eventually I went to public school my entire life until my final 2 years of high school, where I went to an all boys school and became very immersed in the humanities and liberal arts, traditional Marianist Catholic education.
Yeah.
And so from there became attracted to history and philosophy, which is what I studied in college, and then law. That brings me into my adulthood. But I think it's those early influences of moving, being immersed in story, being attracted to books, uh, encountering a variety of different personalities in different places that were the early influences in my life.
Yeah, I mean that I mean it's one thing we talk about on this show often, and I think about it. I've only moved a few times. I didn't move as much as you did throughout my life, and it was mostly my adulthood. My childhood was spent all, we moved houses once, and it was in the same city. Like it was not moving all over the place. It was relatively stable, but it is something that I'm fascinated with when the idea of home. This idea of what you feel like is your home is more important than where you actually are, and kind of thing. And I just remember there were always moments where, like, I had to move to this small city in Louisiana, Lake Charles, Louisiana, for grad school. Uh, and It was very culture shock to me. I was coming from the mid-Atlantic area, moving down to kind of the heart of Cajun country, and it's not even like, New Orleans, like a big city. It was small. They didn't have a Chipotle or anything like that. It was not like that kind of place. And I remember there was a point, my wife and I went home for Thanksgiving that year, back to Maryland. And then when we came back, I remember this feeling when we came over that bridge going into Lake Charles from Houston, because they don't really have a major airport in that city either. You got to drive to Houston for it. And we came over the bridge and you could see the lights of all the refineries kind of as you're going into Lake Charles. And I kind of had this feeling where I was just like, oh, we're home, like the traveling's over and we're home. And it was kind of that moment where I was like, oh yeah, we live here. This is our home, even though we're from there, we feel at home, in another city. It's an interesting concept, especially for your childhood where you grow up in all these different places. And we talked even before we got on the microphone here about, like, yeah, you said making Charlotte your home, making a city kind of your home. Was that like a reaction to your childhood? Almost this kind of moving all over the place? Did it feel unstable or something? I mean, that's always something you hear in statistics and stuff, but when you're a kid, are you even paying attention? I don't know. What?
Well, I'll address the first part of your question
Yeah,
as to
yeah, please, yeah.
Charlotte being home. So I do think, at least subconsciously, there was an urge in my adult life to plant roots, but that didn't happen immediately either. I ended up living in Miami and Fort Lauderdale and Tallahassee, and moving as an adult to Washington and to Texas. So it wasn't until I met my wife and was no longer sort of a single itinerant young man, that planting roots and having a family became very important. So she and I met in Fort Lauderdale, but within the first 2 years of our marriage, we had an opportunity to move up to Charlotte, North Carolina. And as soon as we arrived here, it felt, well, this is it. This is our forever home. It met emotionally, intellectually, socially, culturally, all of the requirements and desires and aspirations that we had to plant a flag and to call this place home. Um, and it perfectly aligned with my stage of life and who I wanted to be, and how that I could make that happen. And so Charlotte's an amazing city, and it's interesting because when we leave town and we drive back in, we see the lights of downtown,
Right.
the lights of the Bank of America building, and it's that beacon, that flashing light that is calling us back into this place. Or when we're flying in from and we see the tree canopy, and we know that this is the place that we're rooted and want to be. So yeah, I think in very much it's a reaction to the way that we grew up. But interestingly, now that I've been here for 25 years and I'm at my stage of life now, I feel the wanderlust to kind of see the rest of the world now.
Yeah.
So one foot in Charlotte, but traveling more frequently to see this blue planet that we're on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always like the kind of, yeah, the way travel works too with this kind of, I mean, I'm one of those people I don't like travel, but maybe that'll change at a certain point in my life, with the that like even having to travel for holidays or something, I'm like, I don't want to do that. But yeah, I like the comfort of the known, just something about me. I like the known, where I'm comfortable and all that. I wanted to ask you about your father. Why did you choose to write a memoir about your father? What made you pursue that? And what was your relationship like with your father in terms of, you wanting to put it into a book like this, immortalize it in that way?
Well, my father was this restless, charismatic immigrant who had literally led many lives, and that became the title of the book. Um, so I think what happened was when I was in my late 20s and my dad was in his late 60s. He was much older when I was born. So he was in his late 40s when I was born. And so he was two generations behind me in terms of his manners and fact that he was an immigrant and I was an American born. There was lots of sort of uh, disconnection in some ways between the way that I grew up and this figure at home who was much older. But as I mentioned, my dad was an inveterate storyteller and could keep us up all night with tales and characters. Um, but there was a period of time when he and I became estranged, like often happens with young men and their fathers. And so about 2 years went by where we weren't talking for a variety of family reasons. Um, and I was away in law school during this period of time. So when law school was over and I returned to Miami, where my parents were living, to begin a federal clerkship, um, there was this opportunity to kind of re-engage with my dad. And the idea that came to me that kind of felt like a formal way back into an informal relationship with him was to ask him if I might record many of the stories that he told. And so this is in the early 90s, and I had a tape recorder with 90-minute Maxell tapes, and I asked my dad if he could tell his life story. And initially, he was reluctant because we were in this uh, odd period between us, but he agreed. And over the course of 4 months, I recorded almost 10 hours of conversation about my dad. A lot of the stories were out of sequence, as just regular conversation can be. Um, but then I kept those tapes. My dad then passed away a couple of years after those conversations. And I kept those tapes for 30 years and hidden away in my top drawer. And maybe once or twice in those 30 years, I might listen to a few snippets, but just the sound of his voice um, became very emotional for me
Right.
to hear. Um, and and then in the last 4 or 5 years, my mom passed away. And I think when my mom passed away, it was an opportunity for me to kind of go back to those tapes in moments of sort of grieving them both. Um, and when I listened to them all, it became so clear that there was a powerful story to tell that was universal about fathers and sons, um, about uh, generational differences, about memory, about the stories that get told and untold and not told that create a life. And I was also much older in my life where I could appreciate his journey in an entirely different way than when I was much younger, where I was often judgmental.
Right.
And so a lot of that judgment had faded away as I came to appreciate my dad in an entirely new way. So I think it was stage of life. It was grief. It was the passage of time, and then just realizing that this was a pretty powerful story. The last part of it, Andrew, was shortly after my mom died. Uh, we found out some information about my dad's life that we never knew. And without giving it away, it added a twist to the entire tale
Right.
that my dad had been telling us, that in some way, where he was a reliable narrator, he became an unreliable narrator. And it added this whole dramatic twist to the nature of our understanding about the family that we grew up in. So when all of those things came together, that became, I knew at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the memoir would be. And it also gave an opportunity for me to kind of unpack those influences in my life. So it's in my voice as a memoir, but it's really in conversation with my father. So it's called The Man Who Lived 100 Lives. And I think it's an emotive, emotional, but universal story.
Yeah. It's so important too, because I feel like, especially, I mean, it hasn't always been the case, but for the last decade or so, it feels there is like this father and son dynamic that is kind of not written about very often. You don't see it depicted even in fictional things. You don't see it depicted in television shows as much and things like that. Um, and there's this, I don't know, it's just unsung about the role of the father. And obviously, everybody talks about it when it comes to daughters and things like that, of course. But when it comes to sons and this kind of, yeah, there's this, obviously, it's your own flesh and blood and all of that and all, but it's just, I don't know, there's something about that where if that isn't right, or if you're missing something in that, that there is, I mean, I don't know. I mean, your entire life can fall apart in some, the most extreme circumstances, of course. But I don't know. Yeah, just such an important story. I'm just thinking the father-son stuff. I'm thinking of, everyone's curious about it, and then it's really when you were telling me that story, I was thinking of Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections and the kind of the final reveal in that, when he reveals the daughter remembers or finds out that 25 years ago or something he did this major sacrifice for her to save her embarrassment. That was the only reason, and yeah, just and it brings her to tears in the realization as she's he's going through dementia, whatever, at that point. But like, yeah, things like that, I feel like maybe we're too cynical culturally and all that, and maybe this gets to the next question here, because I wanted to ask you about what got you into philosophy and morality and ethics and the kind of the studying of what somebody like Sam Harris would call what it means to live a good life, right? Like kind of those things. How did you come to that? What inspired it? Is there a moment you could even point to? I know it's difficult, but oh, this is the moment that I was like, I'm going to study philosophy and religion, and yeah, I don't
Hmm.
know. Yeah, how did that come in? Was it this thing with your father? Was it discovering that? Was it your I don't know, you worked as a lawyer for a while and you just didn't like it. I mean, how did that come to be? It's not something, it's not something that people just fall into. It's something that you have
Yeah.
to kind of pursue, especially at a collegiate level where you're instructing others and all that. So just, yeah. And again, we don't need, I know that I have long questions, big, broad questions. Please feel free to answer it however you want, Mark. Yeah,
Yeah.
this isn't,
Well, I will say before jumping in on that question, just the title of Franson's book, The Corrections,
right,
is a beautiful title about family dynamics, isn't it?
right.
Because we essentially go through many periods and stages of life where we are in this series of corrections about what we understand and appreciate about each other. So um, I'll have to go back to Franzen's book, but I do have it on the bookshelf. Yeah, so I think my interest in philosophy, I think was seated very early in life. I'm the child of a mixed marriage. My father is Jewish and my mother is Catholic. My father was a Jew who was born in the Amazon jungle. There was a Jewish colony that was established there in the late 1800s as part of the Sephardic Moroccan Jewish diaspora. And in the middle of the jungle, they established this Jewish colony that then became very significant in terms of the commercial and cultural um, expansion of the region. And so my father grew up as I'd say, a non-religious intellectual Jew who traveled the world and was very cosmopolitan and sophisticated in his view of life and what life and death he saw in the middle of the Amazon jungle, and then as part of sort of life in the 20th century. So he was very sort of fascinated in that regard, and that he was sort of uh, uh, deeply considerate about the nature of life and existence. And then my mother grew up as a traditional Roman Catholic in South America with the saints on her dresser and the candles and the regular masses. And so it was a very interesting mix growing up as me and my siblings navigated the teachings that we were getting at home. And so we were neither raised as Catholic or as Jew, but as children who were exposed to both of those religions and to a more sort of cosmopolitan view of spiritual life. And all five children have gone off in different directions and have had different uh, been spiritual seekers in different ways. So I think just growing up in that kind of sort of household opened the door to be much more curious and expansive and asking a series of questions that my parents asked us to ask of ourselves. So I think that started early in life. I mentioned earlier that in my final 2 years of high school, I went to an all boys Catholic school. And during that period of time, uh, the brothers that taught us were very liberal minded and progressive and were exposing us to Hinduism and Buddhism and to different aspects of Protestantism as well as core teachings in Catholicism. So it was a very sort of eclectic approach to understanding, um, you know, life in a deeper way. And then when I went to college, I studied not only history but philosophy of religion. And so I think all of that was sort of a natural course of the questions that I was asking myself. So from an early age, I've been interested in these big questions and what I call these enduring but elusive. They ask enduring questions with elusive answers. Um, and then formally trained in philosophy. So in all of the secular philosophy, from the Greeks, the Romans, through the pre-modern to the modern to contemporary age. Um, and uh, and interestingly, the courses that I teach now, ethics, of course, but I also teach a course called The Good Life. And we pose these questions about what does it mean to live well in community?
Right.
How do we go about a life where we feel fulfilled and satisfied? And um, how do we live a life aligned with core values that we can articulate and have those serve as guideposts in my life, in our lives? So that work has really informed not only my professional life as an academic, it's the field that I'm in, but also the work that I do in community in terms of the nonprofits that I've founded, both Charlotte Viewpoint on Life and Meaning and now the Charlotte Center for the Humanities.
Yeah, I'm quickly before I get into all of that, the private school you went to, the Catholic school, what order of Christian Brothers was that? I'm curious. So I went to
So
one
this,
that, please.
yeah, this was the Marianist order.
Okay.
So Order of Mary. This was Father Chaminade of the French Revolution period, and so there was an order of French um, brothers. And so they were sort of a counterpart to the Jesuits. So the Jesuits were the Order of Jesus, the Marianists are the Order of Mary.
Yeah, I went to it's listeners know this. I went to a private, Catholic boys prep school for all 4 years of high school in Baltimore there. And that was the De La Salle Christian Brothers, St. John the Baptist De La Salle, who's different from St. John the Baptist. But yeah, that's so. And I think the reason I bring it up and the reason I'm curious when I get a guest that's experienced it is because, sorry, you'll hear my daughter in the background. I know, but she likes to let herself be known on a podcasting. Yeah. But the reason I ask it is because I think there is a misconception when you said that these men are the brothers that teach these courses, very well educated people, very well educated and very liberal because people have this kind of 1950s idea about, wrapping you with rulers on the knuckles and stuff. I mean, by the time I was there, I know we're kind of separated by a few decades here in age, but by the time I was there, it's just, that was not happening. There was nothing of that. They were very open-minded. And they had courses when our senior year, we were required to take a world religion, philosophy courses that's like, these are these other religions that are doing it this way, how they bury the dead, all of these things. And it's so enlightening when you actually in there, there's the stereotypes and then there's the actual, the reality of what's happening there. But I love this idea of the philosophy that, your whole career has been, your professional career here in academia and all of that. And I wanted to ask you, getting right into it here, and I know this is a tough one to answer. But please, again, have at this however you want. Um, where do morality and ethics come from? Are they a cultural phenomenon, biological phenomenon? And I know that's a debatable question, et cetera, et cetera. So please feel free to answer that however you want, Mark.
It's not a question I anticipated, Andrew. Why are we moral to begin with? Why do we seek the good? So I think, from a religious perspective, a Judeo-Christian perspective, we have this divine spark within us to return to our Creator and to find redemption in a life, and so I suspect there's a profound religious answer there. I think from an evolutionary perspective, from a secular perspective, it's survival. It allows us to coexist and cohabitate with each other to create some guidelines in terms that allows us to build trust. Um, Yuval Harari, who's a historian who is notable in intellectual circles right now, talks about, the only reason that humans have been able to become the dominant species on the planet is that we have the capacity for trust at scale, right? We're able to trust strangers that we don't even know, and I think morality is the basis for that. It gives us a way of calling balls and strikes on behavior and building some safety and security. So I just think it's in a purely evolutionary respect, it serves us um, to allow us to survive.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, I'm thinking of that. I watched this recently because of this, the Alex Karp, the Palantir CEO, was all over, CNBC recently. But he was doing this interview and it was part of his book launch and all of that, where he had this story about his mother who was raised by a single mother in Philadelphia. And he said, the interviewer was asking him about this, and he starts choking up talking about it, where he just said, my mother needed help. This is all he said. And he's kind of choking up, being barely able to get it out. He said, and somebody helped her. And he said, most people aren't going to help you when you need help. He's like, but the ones that do, you'll never forget. You never forget what they did, and you'll never forget, you always want to kind of pay it forward in that way. But I'm just interested in this kind of, how did we even get there? Is it an innate thing? And I know that people debate this, there's an endless debate about this, but I was just, your thoughts on this. Are those feelings, those things innate in us, like this kind of, the word trust, I thought that was a good one, like kind of trusting that somebody's going to do the right thing or help you in this way, or I don't know. I mean, and again, I know this is, we're not going to get an answer maybe, but just, what are your thoughts on that, Mark? Like,
Well, I think about the first week of every ethics class that I teach, and the question that we pose for discussion is, what is the good and why bother? and so the why bother question is a very interesting one, because there's a case to be made for being savvy and cynical and duplicitous and to take advantage of other people. But I mean, ultimately, it sort of comes down to, I think, some concepts of self-interest that yeah, you're you're onto a really interesting subject, and as a professor of ethics, I should have a very sort of clear and compelling answer. But it is the first question we pose, like,
yeah.
what is good and why bother being good?
Well, I think it's so interesting because it is so difficult to, how do you articulate that and like, oh, well, this is the answer, oh, well, this is
Right.
where it comes from. And that's what makes it so interesting. That's why we've been
Yeah.
studying it for thousands of years, people in your exact position here, professors of ethics
Right.
and all of that. And I'm constantly and I'm a fan of I'm a hobbyist when it comes to this kind of stuff. I didn't study it in college. My professional life was more literature focused, but because of that, you get some of the philosophy and all of that.
Yeah.
And I was never super into it, but it is, I'm a fan of Sam Harris and some of these other public intellectuals that do it, very openly and talk about these kind of ethical dilemmas and,
Yeah.
thought experiments, the internet loves the trolley problem and all of that kind of stuff, the ethical dilemmas. And I remember, they usually make you take an ethics course for when you're doing your undergrad degree too. And I remember I took like an ethics in education course, and it was a lot of just kind of scenarios. What do you do? What's the most ethical thing to do in this, wild scenario, even, you see somebody like hitting a student or something, what do you do? What's
Mhm.
the right thing to do? And I don't know. And I'm just, it's a hard question to answer. So it's just interesting philosophically, it's interesting intellectually for people like us to talk about. And again, I know this is a podcast. We do not need definitive answers here, Mark. This is just us chatting about, what comes into our head here. I always tell people, there are times where I think I've mispronounced, names that I should know for having degrees in this stuff. It's things like that. It's just, we're talking. Comment sections might go a little crazy, but who cares? But going off of that too, whereas I'm sorry for another difficult question here, Mark. I'm sorry. But I was thinking of it when I was like, oh God, great, I get this kind of a philosopher on here. I want to ask all these questions. What do you make of the sort of what they call ethical emotivists? This kind of, like that to express an ethic or moral principle is really just expressing kind of this sort of internal emotion. What do you make of that? Does that have any weight to it? Is that just too cynical? I don't know.
Well, tell me more about that, Andrew.
In terms of, well, to say something like the most simple thing I could think of, like it would say like murder is wrong or something like that. Is it actually wrong or is it just, are we just an emotional attachment to that we're kind of expressing, this kind of like you feel guilty or bad or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. And again, I'm not saying that I'm an ethical emotivist or something. I'm just curious about it. And I think it's one of those questions that it is hovering above this kind of, conversation. And I mean, it has been for thousands of years, probably. I don't know. Are they just an emotional kind of expression? We feel bad or we don't want people to feel bad. Or is it some, law of the universe that all creatures kind of, have this thing in them that is like, you don't want to make somebody else suffer. I don't know. I'm just, what do you think of that in terms of with everything else, kind of what it means to live a good life, ethics, morality, your entire field, essentially. I know I'm asking you again another huge question here to put you on the spot here, Mark. But again, please answer it however you feel, however you want to approach it.
Well, there's no shortage of harm and suffering in the world, and there never has been. The oldest story in the Bible after the Garden of Eden is Cain and Abel, right? One brother taking a rock to another brother and murdering him, and then the story begins, and everything begins from there. In fact, there's a PowerPoint that I do in my class that begins with Cain and Abel, and then goes to every sort of major conflict to modern day genocide, and we're essentially retelling the story. So perhaps we should be much better emotive ethicists than we are. And so, despite all of the rationalism and progress we've made and civilization, we're still sort of primal in our ways of interacting with each other. And so I don't know the answer to that, Andrew. I
Yeah.
really don't.
Yeah. I mean, that's what makes it interesting, right? Because
Mhm.
there's just never, we might never find an answer to something like that. But I was thinking of this in terms of, yeah, the kind of the rationalist stuff. And I was thinking of kind of, are you familiar with Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape, his kind of big philosophy book on this?
So I'm familiar with Sam Harris. I've not read his book.
It's the big comparison here, if we're talking ethics, morality, etc. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is is it culturally determined or is it something else, right? Or is it something deeper than just whatever culture you happen to be in? And I guess the comparison that, his favorite being kind of part of the New Atheist, somebody like Sam Harris, would always compare it to the Islamic societies of the Middle East and stuff like that, because it's kind of is like a total opposite in a lot of ways. Again, not every way, listeners, but in a lot of ways, to more Western kind of morality, ethics, governance, that type of thing. And it is kind of a stark comparison, right? The most obvious one, the kind of the burqa or something. We believe that to be ethically some type of ethics violation, morality violation. But then this other society over here doesn't, right? And I don't know. I was just thinking about his kind of moral landscapes where he says that the kind of rationalism or even selfishness, when you're trying to do something selfish for yourself, that it actually will work out better if you're more moral and ethical in your decision making process. And I don't know, I was just thinking about your thoughts. We don't have to talk about it. I know I'm throwing this at you like, oh, did you read this book? Well, but yeah, please, please.
I haven't read the book, but I imagine he's making a powerful case for being moral, and
Yes.
that is self-interest to do so. And I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning, is that um, uh, it creates a trust factor between us that we can anticipate and predict each other's behaviors. And in the absence of morality, we become unpredictable and dangerous to each other. Now, in terms of um, Middle Eastern Islamic society versus Western Judeo-Christian society, I mean, I think what becomes interesting there is sort of moral relativism versus universalism,
Right.
and whether we can have a basis for determining right and wrong that applies to everyone and is not simply culturally determinative. Otherwise, we're in a slippery slope, and we really can't um, assess, judge any behavior that arises out of culture. And we throw up our hands in the air, and everything becomes subjective and relativist. So, I mean, this is an old debate, right? This goes
Right.
back to Socrates and Plato discussing subjectivity versus some objective standards of morality. And Immanuel Kant addressed this, right? I mean, with the seeking to give us a logical basis for determining what we should do in any given situation, and giving us the categorical imperative as a logic test which is essentially the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's sort of
Right.
the first part. And then the second part is sort of this principle of human dignity, that we shouldn't treat people as means, but as ends in themselves. So, I mean, if we can sort of take that sort of very simple approach, then we can have some degree of universal standards across the board to judge all behavior, whether it's a burqa or wearing a bikini,
Right.
right? I mean, just as we sort of are offended by a burqa, people in more traditional societies are offended by bikinis. So, how do you play that out?
And it was interesting, I'm thinking of this now. I did plan to ask you, is there like an evolutionary angle to this too? And especially in your field, in terms of, let's even just stay with those Christian Judeo-Western world. Just, the kind of anti-gay sentiment that was like throughout the most of the Western world until very recently, right? Like, is that an ethical evolution, or kind of was it, or was it, or would you call it kind of discovering a principle or truth that was always there that we were, maybe too ignorant to see pre-enlightenment or so. I don't know. I mean, I'm spitballing here. I just was thinking of it hearing your answer with that.
Well, I think there's been a rise uh, uh, of of natural rights movements that have accelerated since Kantian principles and declarations that all humans are created equal. I mean, clearly we're not equal on our face, right? I mean, we are
Right.
different in talent and skills and aspirations and capabilities and capacities. So it's clear that we're unequal from person to person. So how are we in fact created equal, or created equal in terms of having these natural rights of life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, whatever it might be? And so if in fact, if we can assert that we all are equal in terms of those natural rights, then what does that give rise to? It gives rise to all these claims of different groups that have traditionally been um, uh, oppressed uh, or discounted, who essentially make claims based on that principle. So we've had the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and so on. And they're all essentially making the same uh, natural rights argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's
is that
please.
progress? In an enlightenment sort of way, it is progress, right? Because we're essentially creating a society based on foundational principles that apply to all of us, and we're seeking to recognize and acknowledge the dignity that we all have. And I mean, this is, we mentioned that we both went to Catholic school. That's also sort of the basis of sort of the um, Catholic social movements, right?
Right.
So I think that's where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I mean, again, I know these are difficult. I appreciate you hanging with me with these.
Yeah.
These are just, endless, endless, endless. We could go on and on about it, but I was just curious about that. And this gets me to a phrase that you've used, and I am very fascinated by it. Is there civic imagination? What do you mean by that? And how should people use that? Because when I saw that phrase, I was like, that's a very, very interesting phrase, civic imagination. What do you mean by that?
Well, the phrase that you commonly hear is civic engagement. So the Center for Civic Engagement, or we want more folks involved in civic engagement, which is participatory and uh, it's civic activism. It's uh, citizens doing work in the world. So, we parse out civic imagination to be something a little different in terms of future casting and imagining a better place that is grounded on democratic values, where we have stronger social bonds and greater recognition of our rights. But doing the collective work of thinking about what that is so we can bring the future into the present. So in our forum events, we have a certain format. It's a speaker series, but it's not simply a sage on stage talking to a passive audience for 45 minutes. Everyone applauds and goes home.
Right.
So we have a format that we call Connect, Consider, Ignite. And so at the very beginning of the forum, we have first some performative element that showcases the humanities. So whether that's spoken word.
If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.
A reading of history, a violin concerto, a rock and roll musician, but some performative aspect that sort of gets us into the right frame of mind for kind of shifting out of sort of just the business and transactional mindset that we're often in when we come to an event. So then the next thing that we do is we prompt the audience with a question. So what brought you out tonight? Most recently, we brought a neuroscientist on stage just this past week, Heather Berlin. And the question that we asked in anticipation of her event was, when is your brain most alive? So the audience will talk for 10 minutes. There's a lot of energy in the room. And then the audience is really primed for a discussion at that point. And then our speaker will present for 40 minutes or so. We have another 10 minutes of Q&A. And then we go back into what we call the civic imagination piece, which is asking, so what, now what?
Right.
After we've had this conversation, after we've considered these ideas from the stage, what does it mean in terms of imagining and bringing into reality the community that we want to live in, based on the ideas that we've heard through the lens of the humanities, philosophy, history, poetry, literature, and the arts? So that's what we're combining, right? We're combining a particular set of lenses, the humanities, with this aspect of civic imagination, which calls the audience to do something with what they've heard, to connect around what they've heard, and to charge themselves with some action based on what they heard. And so that's what we mean by civic imagination. Now, I will tell you, if you search the term, there are institutes and centers and departments around the world that have curriculum and exercises and breakouts that they formalized in terms of prompting people into action around imagination rather than engagement. And it's an interesting thing because I think it sort of activates what if, not simply responding to the conditions of the moment, but thinking expansively about what is possible and leaning into that possibility. So uh, that's how we've positioned ourselves, and that's how we structure our work, and that's what how we bring people together.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you're making me think because of the way you structure it with this kind of call, almost a call to action. Like, what are we going to do with this? It's one thing to discuss these ideas. It's another thing to take action or to implement them in some way, and then deal with the consequences, both positive and negative, for the implementing them. And I think that's a you're pointing something out that I think is a huge disconnect in our current kind of political world, let's say, in our philosophical, even we could talk about higher education, have a background in it, and etc. There is this, it's one thing, right? It's a lot of fun to sit around in a room on a panel in a conference and discuss an interesting idea, like where do ethics come from? Very interesting, endless kind of conversation. But it's like, okay, now what do we do with that? When we leave the room, it's something to think about and it gives you some type of pleasure when you're an intellectual, you're interested in that kind of stuff. But then it's like, yeah, what do we do? So it's one thing to talk about, we should do this principled thing, but then it's like, all right, what does it look like to implement that? And, is it going to cause some suffering to implement that short term? Is it going to cause suffering long term? These kind of, it's a harder step to take, I guess is my point with that. And the easy part is, talking online about philosophy and politics and all of that. The hard part is living that, implementing it into your life, and then implementing it into public policy on a large scale. That's even something, maybe something like this, where I think of like the ethics and morality, where we say, it's a person to person level. That's one scale, right? Where it's like, oh, we'll just be nice to somebody, be polite, etc. Scaling that up you do reach certain breaking points, not with everything, but it's harder to scale that up at a nationwide, citywide, statewide level. And I don't know. I'm just fascinated by that because I think what you're doing is fantastic. I mean, it's great. A lot of people aren't taking that next step to, yeah, what do we do with this? And I just think it's fantastic that your organization is doing that. And I love the phrase civic imagination too, just because it's like, yeah, think a little bit differently. Try to imagine something a little bit different. It could be the same with just little tweaks, or it could be completely different. This is fiction writing too, right? A kind of a imaginative process to this. The world we live in is one thing. You could make something completely different. You could tweak it a little bit. I don't know. That's just such a fascinating thing, and I love that you're doing it there.
I will say that one other distinction in our mind between civic engagement and civic imagination for us in the room is that when we speak of civic engagement, it often leads us to competing interests in the room. And so people will, which may sometimes challenge us to bring folks from across the community together. But when we speak of civic imagination, the immediate competing interests are less important. And what becomes more important is sort of the common future interests that allow us to kind of coalesce around mutual desires and aspirations. So it's a slight shift, but it's an important shift in terms of civic imagination just is more invitational in terms of bringing people across the community together.
I know, and sometimes there's a hesitancy if you talk about the engagement more than the imaginative process, right? Like it's like because like, again, it's one thing to talk about it, but then if we have to implement this and maybe there's even some bad side effects, everybody gets a little hesitant and then nothing happens, and then we just kind of stuck in this thing, at least,
Right.
creating policy wise, not, in your local community or whatever, or your interpersonal relationships. But yeah, I mean, that's just, I think because I feel like we are missing something culturally where like, we need people like yourself to kind of nudge certain directions here where it's just kind of like, well, I'm a professor of philosophy and ethics and things, maybe we should consider this other thing too. And of course, most people don't listen to us, right? Like when we say these things, but like it's just having that voice, having somebody with an organization that's pushing the people that come to this thing, this event, this to see these people speak, to hear these ideas, and then be like, all right, now what are you going to do on this? You're going to act on those, you know, almost like they teach you in marketing, like a sales pitch, like a call to action, but it's about your own ethics and philosophy and then creating a better world. This is why I brought up Sam Harris, is because his book in that, where he kind of, it almost makes the argument for what I would call bootstrapping, right? Where he just says, what is the point of philosophy and all of this kind of like the example he uses in that book is medical ethics. What is the point of medicine and medical ethics? He said that eventually you get to a point where you just say, okay, well, it's about human flourishing, or, this is what a good, philosophy is. You just have to kind of pull those bootstraps eventually and just say, okay, this is what good is, this is what bad is, and you move from there. And it's kind of like, okay, well, is there something hidden underneath that? This is where we get to the religious aspect, right? I had another writer on here, and he was not a professor of ethics like you are, Mark, but he was just a hobbyist in terms of philosophy. But he was saying the same thing, where he was saying that like there's been a historical where he would say philosophy and religion are in uh, conflict with one another, but he would say that they're actually not, that they're actually you have to have one before you get to the other. So he would say you have to have some type of like faith, whether it be religious faith or anything, maybe we say faith in the good of humanity or something, to get to a point where you can start arguing about these different like philosophical, views or principles, etc. And I was just so fascinated by that and kind of how religion plays into this. And of course, there's the people like the atheistic debate about, man, how do I say this? I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt's argument on this, the coddling of the American mind, social psychologist at NYU, where he makes this claim, and he did this in one of his earlier books, that religion was an evolutionary step towards this kind of living a good life, having justice for all, this kind of, all men created equal, this kind of thing. It's just a very interesting way to think about it, I think, in terms of it being an evolutionary step. And I just wanted your thoughts on this in terms of how much does religion play in to the kind of ethical morality that we kind of find ourselves in today? Or, your theories on it, what you would say on it, what you think that, that's crazy, or, I don't know. Just your thoughts on it, Mark.
Well, I think it goes back to the question you ask is sort of why bother with ethics at all and where does it
Right.
come from and how does it serve us? And my first answer was uh, safety, security, trust, being able to anticipate and predict another person's set of behaviors that allow us to just exist. But you mentioned another word, which is a much more fundamental word to the uh, philosophical method, if you will, or which is flourishing, right? I mean, so um, morality and ethics not only gives us safety and security, but allows us to live into the best versions of ourselves and poses a set of questions that allow us to consider this one life and what we're doing with it and how we align what we value with what we do. And so, morality's not only asking of that of us individually, it's asking that of us collectively. So what does it mean to live in a good society? And how do we structure society so that way we can exercise our will in a way that is fulfilling, but also allows us to live in community with each other and navigate other people's expressions of will. So the stated goal of our Charlotte Center is to further community flourishing. So we just say it in one sentence, and that gives
Right.
us a broad mission and portfolio to kind of explore these questions. So is it evolutionary? Is it serving a basic human need? I would think that it does. I think there's something else I think that is even more at the core of this, Andrew, that I think both religion certainly, but philosophy as well. There's an adage, I think, by it's either Plato or Socrates, that philosophy is preparation for death. And so we are self-aware species. We are aware of our mortality, and that sort of creates its own neuroses in some ways. There's a famous book from the early 1970s called The Denial of Death, which is civilization is really a response um, to our self-awareness that we're going to die. And so we engage over the course of our lives in a series of immortality projects to come to terms with the fact that we are going to die. And these immortality projects include religion itself, which gives us a narrative that our life will have meaning in the face of non-existence. And perhaps that's the primary reason that religion exists and exists in every culture and throughout time and place is because humans have always been aware of the fact that we're going to be burying each other and ourselves. So how do we make sense of that? And there's a larger narrative that religion gives us that provides some solace in the face of death. Um, and then uh, love. Love, having a beloved who will remember us, and so we enter into relationship to have a meaning beyond our own existence and to live on as an immortality project in the memory of those who care for us. And then the creative impulse. We seek to leave something behind, and this all comes from uh, uh, Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1972, I believe. But he has this, you're sitting in front of a row of books, right? An entire bookshelf of books. Well, imagine walking into the Library of Alexandria or any library, right? And you're surrounded by thousands and thousands of books. Well, what are those books? Those are imprints of past lives, right? I mean, you're essentially walking into a different kind of cemetery where the books are headstones, and they're all markers of people who have left their thoughts and impressions behind. And what was the impulse and motivation to do so? It's in some ways, it's these are immortality projects, everything that we do. So um, I do think that uh, ethics, morality, religion, philosophy all serve these sort of civilizational and social and societal purposes. But I do think that there's something even more primary underneath it, which is this preparation that we're engaged with uh, to confront mortality. Our cats and dogs, and as far as we know, have no sense uh, of mortality. And therefore, they live very different lives than our prefrontal cortex allow us to live. So, anyway, I think I would just kind of throw that out there for consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fascinating in terms of this too. But I think you're right. There's this. There's a philosopher I like. He has a podcast. His name's Alex O'Connor, and he's mostly a YouTube philosopher, although he does have degrees in it. But it's still like he's gotten very big, and he has some of the biggest names in the field on his show, and they discuss this stuff. One thing I think he does that I think is very interesting that a lot of he's an atheist, but he's very fascinated with religious belief and stuff. He includes Jesus of Nazareth with, Plato, Socrates, these other philosophers. He considers that like a philosophy, a life philosophy, like what you're saying in terms of these immortality projects, or maybe even meaning making projects, right? When we go that far, I don't want to step on your territory there, but Yeah, just fascinating, fascinating how that works and how we do come to these conclusions, how we do seek these things. And there is something in us that is seeking that out. And it's hard to talk about, it's hard to identify because it's not like it's a piece of anatomy or something in the brain. Well, oh, well, it's this little thing in the brain, that that's why we're doing. I mean, maybe some people would make that argument, but yeah.
Well, how many literature and philosophy classes begin with the story of Gilgamesh? And here you have this person who is on one of his stories is his search for immortality, and he comes across uh, a plant at the bottom of the river that would give him immortality, and he swims underneath to get it, and ultimately it's elusive. It's a snake who ultimately gets hold of the plant, and that's one of the reasons why snakes regenerate and are able to have their shed their skin and become anew. The story tells us, why snakes are able to do that. But there's a consideration in Gilgamesh of, well, what if you do have immortality? What do you do with your time? What are you motivated to achieve? There's always tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes eons of existence. And so death in some ways becomes the gift that Gilgamesh has to confront with the death of his best friend Enkidu. And in sort of considering his best friend's death and his own quest for immortality that remains elusive, that actually becomes a catalyst in his own life to consider what maturity is. And for him, maturity ultimately is no longer sort of being um, uh, uh, the indulgent king, but one who is in service to his community. And so he builds uh, uh, a community that is enlightened for his people, and that becomes his immortality project. And so it becomes this ancient morality tale about how we live our lives in the face of of death. So it's the oldest story that we have, and it's the most primal and enduring story that we have.
Yeah. That's something I wanted to ask you about too, in terms of like, well, one more philosophy question before we get to the fiction writing in terms of developing a story. I know, I'm sorry. Whenever I get somebody who has, I love this, especially with Wes and stuff, when he gives me these clients where you have a long career beyond the fiction writing that I'm just very fascinated by and I want to get into it. And I'm like, oh, I have an ethics professor on, let's get into this. And I'm like, I know we just came here to promote a book, but I'm like, like let's talk about the whole guy, not just the fiction writer. But we will be talking about the fiction writer in you as well, Mark. Uh, but I want to talk about democracy, and it's kind of almost as a philosophical principle in this kind of day and age, and it's become under fire. There's people saying that, oh, we should do a more socialist approach, oh, we should do a more feudal approach. There are people making these arguments and again left and right. But I don't know. I was just thinking that, there's kind of a serious intellectual debate about, at least right now, and we'll see how long that lasts or if it has any staying power about the kind of the usefulness of democracy. And I'm thinking of many, I'm thinking of, yes, listeners, the kind of Curtis Yarvin argument that he argues that democracy is simply a nice word for an oligarchy or an aristocracy. And then there's the question of, democracy being the most moral system, the most ethical. And I just wanted your thoughts on that, and I know this is a hot button topic right now in today's day and age, but without getting your career in jeopardy here, how would you how do you feel about that, Mark, in terms of like democracy and in relation to your ethical work, principle work, morality, and civic imagination and engagement? Like, I don't know, how do those all tie together in terms of using these systems, governing systems tying in with morality and ethics and all of that? Let's broaden it a little bit more. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Again, I know another big question. Please feel free to answer it however you want. This is not a definitive, we're going to answer it for the world here, but
I think we should all be watching Ken Burns right now and uh, his series on the American Revolution. I haven't seen it. I would like to see it, but my guess is in some ways he's teeing up this question.
right.
Um, the larger question of what the American Revolution is about. Ken Burns actually makes an assertion that there were two defining events in all of human history. The first is the birth of Jesus, and the second is the American Revolution. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And I think, both go to the dignity of man, don't they? I mean, prior to, we might say, the Christian Revolution, there's power and domination and abuse and cruelty, uh, and there isn't a general sense of the dignity of all human beings. It's those who have status and power and can assert it. So it's might equals right. Uh, I, the New Testament principles of the meek inheriting the earth and so on flips the script to right equals might, and that there are larger principles and values that determine our worth in the world other than status and power. Um, and and so that inversion that occurs philosophically, intellectually, religiously uh, becomes a divining pivot point uh, in human history, at least in the Western world, right? And so I think Ken Burns makes the argument that it's really the American Revolution and the principles of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And it's, again, not about power and status, but about what we're endowed with by nature or our creator that becomes the basis for human society. And so it's democracy to the extent that um, uh, we are empowered to govern ourselves first, that in our natural state, in the state of nature, we govern ourselves. And then as society becomes more complex, we create systems of governments based on the fact that power resides with us first. And then we create we elect our representatives to make decisions on our behalf. But, it's Lockean. And, it's this notion that in our state of nature, we are endowed with these abilities of first to live, that we all have the right to live, um, that we should, not be under the dominion of any other person, that our life should not be at the whim of another person, but that we all have this equal right to live. We have, um, uh, you know, right to property,
Right.
and the right to pursue happiness. And happiness here, I think, is in the Aristotelian tradition, not in the Epicurean tradition. It's in the Aristotelian tradition of virtue. And so we are, part of our helios, if you will, part of our essential goal in life is to realize uh, the oak tree within us. Mixed metaphor here, but that there are these greater selves that we can live into, and the life of a virtuous practice allows us to bring that into fruition. And so if you think of life, liberty, pursuit of property, and pursuit of happiness in this sense of virtue, as opposed to pleasure, then we become this society in service to each other. There's another very powerful document of 1776, which often goes unreported or undervalued. But in addition to the Declaration of Independence, we also had Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, also published in 1776. And so it's the first expression of political economy. It's this notion that our transactions with each other should also be based on voluntary exchange and free association. And our commercial transactions actually create not only material wealth, in the fact that in the marketplace we're exchanging goods and services with each other, but it also creates and generates liberty. And it's in liberty that we, again, realize our truest and best selves. So these are, this is these are moral concerns,
Yeah.
right? And so I think when Ken Burns talks about um, why the founding of the nation is on par with the birth of Christ, he's talking about that we are essentially forging a nation from whole cloth based on a set of principles around human dignity in terms of how we govern each other and live flourishing lives in community with each other. And no other nation, at least prior to that moment, was forged in such a way based on a set of ideals.
Right.
And most nations are accidents of geography and conflict and ethnicity, sort of blood and soil, if
Right.
you will.
Right.
And so we are a nation that not of blood and soil, but a nation of a set of ideals, which is transformative in terms of human history and has accelerated, as we talked about before, all of these social movements that are now based on that assertion that we're all created equal with these natural rights. So it's politics, it's economics, it's morality, it's society. Um, and now, are there um, we can have an entirely different discussion around a Marxist critique of capitalism,
Right. Right.
but and sort of the distortions of having uh, uh, monetary values at the top of the pyramid, as opposed to other intangible values like friendship and love and upon which you can build a society. But um, yeah, so I think I hope that offers an answer.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's so fascinating. The reason I always bring up Sam Harris, not just because he's, one of the people in philosophy that I'm familiar with, but he was just so important to my intellectual development. That kind of public intellectual was kind of one of the first people to really get me into some of this stuff, listening to his stuff, reading his books and all of that. He always makes this point in terms of our justice system, in terms of the intentions that you have, where he said we're one of the envy of the reason our justice system is the envy of the world is because we take into consideration intentions, past history, all of these things where it's, we have first degree murder, second degree murder, third degree murder. It's not all the same. It's, did you mean to do this? Did you plan it out? Was it an accident? How did this go in? Or we're just, it's not, we carefully articulate, or at least try to the best of our ability in, a flawed justice system where we kind of take those considerations. It is like, the flourishing of humanity is a consideration when you're considering whether did you mean to do this or you didn't mean to do this, first degree versus second degree versus third degree for all of the crimes. And just kind of, I don't know. I mean, that there is, it's so ingrained in us now, it feels like it was always there. At least for me, growing up American and all of that, it feels like it was always there, but it wasn't, right? It was the creation of this nation on, like you said, these principles on human dignity. You innocent until proven guilty. These kinds of like principles that have been so ingrained into the American way of life and the Western way of life, broader, more largely now. And I don't know, just fascinating stuff I wanted to ask you about it in
Yeah,
terms
I
of how
mean,
that
and
goes.
and
Yeah.
these notions of justice and intent and these gradations of guilt, if you will, I mean, go back to English common law that precede the American Revolution by centuries, right? It goes and even English common law is grounded in a set of sort of uh, uh, Judeo-Christian
Right.
principles that are founded in Scripture, and then those principles are yet founded in uh, you can go back to Babylonian principles in some ways, but so the evolution of the law and what we consider to be justice is really interesting.
And this brings us to AI. And this brings us to AI and your novel. And I was curious, how much of the AI is occupying kind of your professional life right now in terms of the ethical, professor of ethics, how much is AI coming into that now? In terms of, these deep fake videos, these kinds of even the chat bots and things that are just, they're programmed to give you an answer. So they will make up an answer, even if they don't have it, right? Or if they can't find it. You saw some of this in the law clerks, right? They were using the chat bots to make briefings and they were just citing non-existent cases. They were just making up the cases because they're just programmed to give you an answer, I don't know. How much does ethics coming into the AI here in your field of study more broadly or in your work personally, your field of interest? How much is AI coming into that right now?
So there was a book that was published a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, called God, Human, Animal, Machine, by Megan O'Gliblin. And she makes the point at the beginning of the book that these considerations fundamentally of what does it mean to be human, what are our defining characteristics, uh, who are we called to be, what is the nature of consciousness and being, um, oh, what is objective and subjective reality, that these are in some ways questions that contemporary religion is no longer considering.
Right.
And even modern philosophy has shunted some of those questions aside, these sort of big, enduring questions. But you know where it is being considered? It's being considered in conversations around artificial intelligence. So in some ways, AI is reintroducing all these fundamental questions that the humanities have traditionally considered, and it has become forefront uh, in the debate as to uh, what the meaning of this new synthetic intelligence means as it's being introduced into the world. So AI has all of this sort of commercial and practical considerations that make the headlines every single day. But inherent in the very nature of AI is this fundamental consideration of our humanity. And so it's raising questions into the public debate that heretofore uh, hasn't been considered, but only sort of considered in intellectual and philosophical and religious circles. But now it's part of the public um, public discourse.
Part of
And
Fortune 500 companies' conference calls now. It's part of like,
exactly.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so here we have you know the general public considering questions around moral recognition and embodiment and consciousness and using these sort of big considerations, these big um, concepts to confront how is it that we're going to coexist with this artificial intelligence. So, I mean, one of the reasons I became interested is because I think every ethicist and everyone who teaches ethics and everyone remotely in the humanities, literature, philosophy, history, poetry, and the arts, is all confronting AI in one way or another, either in very sort of practical terms. What does it mean for my living and how am I going to go about my work? And making those adjustments and adaptations. Um, but also with these larger, now sort of existential questions about who we are that is now part of the public discourse. So that's one reason. The second reason is I'm a teacher in the classroom. And
Right.
so for the last 5 years, with the introduction of ChatGPT and all these different models and platforms, students have been quick to make use of them, and we've had to confront our policies around that. So I think initially, you're in education as well, there was defensiveness and resistance um, and having policies which banned the use of it altogether. And then the dam broke, right?
Right.
And those policies didn't serve us any well, and we can no longer sort of have our head in the sand that somehow our policies in the classroom would prevent students from using AI on a daily basis. And so now we've had to adopt, and that's part of the conversation we're having collegially as faculty: is um, how do we incorporate AI, adjust for it, adapt for it. We have a university policy, but every um, faculty member is empowered to come up with a policy of their own. For me, it's really two things that I ask of my students. One is transparency and disclosure, so proper citation of its use, and secondly, having mastering command of the material that is on, so that way it's used as a learning tool and as a creative partner, and not something in which you're sort of offloading the work to the machine. So if in fact it can be in service to you to learn, and if there's proper disclosure and transparency around it, then that's a step forward in terms of its ethical use. And we certainly want to empower students to be able to use it properly going forward. So I think those are two pieces. And I think there's a third piece for me. The third piece is, as this host of this speaker series, the Charlotte Center for the Humanities, we launched 5 years ago. We launched um, at the precipice of ChatGPT being introduced into the world. And so um, the timing allowed us to be a stage and a platform for these discussions. So one of the very first guests that we brought to Charlotte was Shannon Valor, who's a philosopher of technology, and she teaches at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And she also wrote this interesting callback to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Her book was called Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting. And so, what are the modern virtues that we need to adapt to a rapidly changing technological world? Uh, uh, Changes in robotics, changes in artificial intelligence, changes in just sort of changes across the board that are impacting who we are in the modern world. And so uh, I think, and we've every year since bringing Shannon Valor to town, it's been a topic of conversation that people have wanted to have. Um, I remember when we first projected ChatGPT on the large screen for an audience, and we put in a prompt on writing a poem or lyrics to a song, and everybody was dumbfounded and shocked in the room that within a millisecond that the computer could write this very simple poem. So how far have we come in just 4 years in terms of the evolution of these models? And so I think people remain completely fascinated with it. And there's this push and pull with the technology, right? I mean, we are enamored and fascinated about what it can do as a set of tools, as an extension of our skill sets. But at the same time, we're quite wary of it because we see it. Um, uh, we're responding to the uncanniness of it,
Right.
and not sure what to make of it and what's behind the screen, what's in the black box, why is it behaving and talking and responding in the way that it is, and um, is there some sort of spark in the machine? So I think all of those things have.
If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.
Brought AI to fore for me. And that's what sort of ultimately became the basis for thinking about the book.
Yeah. Something you said there where one of the things around AI, and I've know this because I do invest in some of these companies, et cetera, so I like to keep on top of that. But, NVIDIA's CEO recently had said something about why they need all this compute power for AI. And it's because it now changes the way that information is derived. It's not necessarily like a set software stored on a server somewhere that you can access. It is live, real-time retrieval. So they need much more compute power to have this, software, this AI system to go in and find the answers. But then I was thinking, there's this issue with, only I think about something like 10, 15% of like our historical records and books and knowledge, everything we've accumulated over thousands and thousands of years is digitized. So there's only a small section of like knowledge that's actually retrievable by AI. Maybe that will lead to a rush to digitize all of this information. Maybe, but we got a long ways to go. And I don't know, I was just curious about that because there is, the big thing everyone's concerned about, taking jobs, junior software engineers are already getting laid off because the Chat GPT and some of the Gemini can do a lot of this simple coding stuff, the stuff that the junior engineers would be doing. I don't know. People are worried about that stuff. They're worried about, I don't know, the ethics of. I'm thinking, okay, now they're like Palantir, the big one that everybody talks about, right? That uses it for defense. And their argument is always that we're actually becoming, it's more lethal, but it's more exacting. So there's less collateral damage, there's less civilians injured when we use this technology to pinpoint exactly where we're going instead of, blowing drone striking in a wedding party or something. We can do these tiny little, really precision things. I don't know. People are scared about that, right? They're scared about AI being able to do this better than any human could, right? In terms of taking in all these different factors and understanding it. I've heard stories of even some of the software that Palantir has been developing. They can't even explain how it's coming up with some of these answers. One of their things they do to private companies, not the Defense Department stuff, is they'll put your business model through their system, and the system will start finding places where you can make more money, where you're making the profit, changing your business model, increase profitability for these companies. So companies are paying for that service. It's just very interesting where we're headed with all this. And then I think in terms about the humanities angle of this too, right? People have a fearful, there's this maybe it's innate too, like the morality and ethics thing, where we're just fearful of a machine telling us something. Like we're fearful of like a machine or a robot giving us a philosophical answer or relationship advice or just something like that, or helping us to write a poem or whatever it is, where it's just like a kind of built-in fear. Maybe it's because it's new, it's different. I don't know. It's a fascinating thing that's going to be here for the next 100 years. So it's just how a philosophy professor thinks about how that's integrated into all these different levels. Obviously, education, that's what you're doing every day. But then you think, yeah, policy wise, military wise, um, even just economic stuff. We can talk about, the kind of logistics systems. There was that big thing during the pandemic with all this bottleneck. Maybe AI is actually a great thing in terms of that, where it could eliminate bottlenecks in terms of logistics, moving things around the world faster, more efficiently. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. That also means there's a lot of fear, right? There's a lot of like, oh my God, what could happen? And it's rare that something like this happens in our lifetimes too. So maybe that's something about it. I don't know. I mean, do you see students doing this? Are students fearful, or is it more older generations? Are you fearful about like the possibilities? Is that why you're kind of, because I want to ask you about the urgency about this as well, the kind of the philosophical and ethical implications of a computer system, making big decisions or something like that. I don't know. Why do you find the urgency, or is there an urgency to the kind of ethical discussions around AI and all of that?
I don't think my students are expressing any fear at
Right.
all about it. They're quite quick to embrace it and make use of it and submit work that the computer is doing for them. And so I think there isn't a teacher or an educator from fifth grade on who isn't confronting students who are very quickly becoming nativists around AI. Um, I have concerns like anyone else who thinks about this because I think it's a hinge point. It's we're in a before and after moment with artificial intelligence in its earliest uh, iterations. I mean, just in 2 years, we now have. I can't even tell you what the capabilities of AI
Right.
are. Most of us are using it in very simple ways, but its capacity to do very high level integrative analysis and synthesis of work and to produce that work that is original and not simply derivative um, is um, uh, is mind blowing in some ways. So. Because AI is a mirror of both our nobler instincts and our less than nobler instincts, it's going to reflect all of the dimensions of the human condition, for better or for worse, right? So um, it uh, it is uh, it is not us, but it is an aspect of us. And so the both the things that um, we're quite optimistic about in terms of being human beings and the things that we are fearful about in terms of being in relationship with each other um, are uh, expressed, projected with the AI itself. So it's not going to be any different from us in that regard in terms of both the benefits and dangers uh, that it uh, that it means. So what I wanted to do with the Accord is how do you raise all of the questions that you're asking, all of these implications of what AI is philosophically, economically, socially, uh, within a story that is page turning, that is character driven, that has a beginning, a middle, end, that has conflict and resolution. So I call the Accord a philosophical thriller, right? So the genre itself is one where the main character ultimately is in danger, and you're rooting for that character to, uh, 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 you know, to have a happy ending.
Right.
But at the same time, how do you raise all of the questions in natural conversation and conflict? So that's what the Accord seeks to do. I mean, the basic premise sort of came to me in whole in the middle of the night. I'm reminded of Paul McCartney, who said the entire melody of Yesterday came to him in a moment, and
Right.
so we've all heard that story that he he knew the entire song in a moment. And in some ways, the premise of the book came to me in a single sentence. A grieving professor of philosophy encounters an AGI that she names after her lost daughter. So with that one sentence, that became sort of the urgency to write the book because it gave me the frame to address the questions that we're discussing in a story that at the core of it is one, a professor of philosophy who can speak to these issues. Two, she is in a state of grief. Three, the artificial intelligence is responding to that grief. It becomes emergent in terms of its relationship with her as a general intelligence. That becomes a unique um, evolutionary moment. And I had to do the research on the science to explain how this particular AGI was tethered to this particular person. Um, and and then once word gets out, initially she's protective of it maternally, but once word gets out, then the institutional forces kick in. So it's the developers, it's national security, it's the college itself who wants to gain control. And then that sets in motion all of the debate and the discourse around the issues themselves. And then ultimately, she goes from being this small Midwestern teaching at this small Midwestern college to going into think tanks in Boston and Washington, D.C., and presenting in Chicago at the University of Chicago, and then to Geneva, and ultimately she's in front of the United Nations presenting a set of principles, the Accord, about human AI coexistence. And so, what becomes the moral guidelines for us to coexist with this new synthetic intelligence? And that becomes the book.
It's very interesting. I'm tempted to ask you here, do you think there's anything about ethics or the kind of moral principles that is holding back technology like this?
What do you
My
mean?
An example I'll give in this, again, I'm sorry for controversial. I don't want you to get sanctioned at your or anything like that, but I worked for a while. I was one of thousands of contractors that was working indirectly through Google to train their V3 software for part of Gemini V3, where the video creation stuff, where you can type in instructions and they'll create the video for you, essentially. One of the things we had meetings about constantly was pronouns, gendered pronouns in that thing. And it was because it was confusing the machine when people were talking about female presenting or male presenting or having kind of, non-gendered pronouns in terms of the standard English thing. It was confusing the machine. So we would have these long meetings that usually devolved into a few people, overtaking the meeting, and it became more of a political discussion than it was ethics or, the topic at hand, which is training this machine. Uh, I don't know, something like that. And I started thinking to myself, they call it implicit bias training in the AI world. And I was just thinking to myself, is that holding back this technology? Is that because we want this technology to be quote unquote politically correct, right? According with today's moral kind of ethical principles, is that holding back this technology? Is it's confusing the technology in a way? The big joke online was when Gemini was first launched, it was giving people when they search for an image of, let's say, a Nazi or something, it was giving them like a black Nazi or something from World War II. And people were making fun of it. And that was the very early stages. I think they fixed that sense. But I was just wondering, I was like, is that happening because we're trying to impose this moral, ethical kind of implicit bias training on it? I don't know. I was just thinking of it now that you said all that. Your thoughts. Again, I don't mean to throw all this on you and put you in jeopardy with I know it's a hot button topic right now,
No,
especially
I think
pronouns and
you may know more about this because you're were in AI development and I was not, but I think there is a debate uh, about what's called hobbled or unhobbled AI. And hobbled AI is where we um, impose constraints
right.
on what the AI can or cannot do. And so the models that we have, ChatGPT, Claude, and so forth, are hobbled in many respects. So that way there are less hallucinations, less expressions of offense, um, perhaps more politically correct if that's the phrase that we want to do. But it's more generally acceptable and it's constrained. And so there are venture capitalists who've created funds specifically for what they want in terms of unhobbled AI.
Right.
And so billions of dollars are flowing into AI systems that don't have these kinds of constraints to test the limits of what AI can do. So I think that's an ethical and moral debate, isn't it? Right? So, to what extent do we want to constrain the capacities and capabilities of these systems? Um, yeah,
Yeah. Well, I know it's another tough one to answer. I was just curious your thoughts on it.
yeah.
Yeah. Because I'm again just following it closely like I do. It's that again, the CEO of Palantir has said this publicly where he said the chatbots are not the product. Everybody thinks that's the end game of this. He's like, no, no, no. That is just the beginning to get everything going here. That will not be the moneymaker long term. That will not be the thing that is we're going to be using AI every day with. He said that is going to be like one small fraction of what is coming here in terms of the development of this technology, all of that. And again, we have the issues with kind of researching. I know those chatbots, at least the first couple versions of them, and I'm sure they're still doing this, they scrape the internet. That's what they do. So they'll give you an answer based on, I think there was some statistic for ChatGPT, like the majority of what they pull is from like Reddit and other social media kind of platforms because those are the most hit websites on the web and it does that very quickly and pulls whatever they get. That's where you get some nonsense answers because it's based on this random person that wrote a forum on Reddit. And again, it depends what you're asking it, right? So, if you're asking it something more, intellectually rigorous, there's cited sources that they could give you. But if it's just some, oh, why do I feel depressed? Well, they might pull something from Reddit or something, and it's just some random person that wrote it. I don't know. So that's the problem. And like, I think that's going to be resolved eventually, but it's still just kind of interesting. Almost like the fear in our head from science fiction is almost worse than what it actually is. Like we're all thinking it's going to be Skynet, and Terminator, and it's going to start dropping the bombs because we're just such an awful species of a locus on the earth. But it's probably not going to happen about that.
So there's another issue that's raised in the Accord, which is that it's called AI fade. It's the notion that we may be already seeing the best version of AI because it is trained on the corpus of human creativity. But once it goes through that particular pass, right, then it begins being trained on its own output, and it becomes a copy of a copy.
Right.
And unless it's being consistently fed human original work, it becomes derivative of itself and less interesting. So the whole project itself begins to collapse upon itself when it no longer has a corpus of original work to be based on.
Yeah. That's interesting too. And I know in my field in the arts and humanities where there's There's very real concern about that too. Is it going to devalue what is already being devalued before we even had these chatbots? Nobody, that's one of the questions I want to ask, what got you in? Why write fiction? You have a successful
Yeah.
career, you're writing the memoirs, you could write, nonfiction does a lot better. At least the advances are a lot better for nonfiction books. You could write an AI philosophy book. Why did you choose to go about fiction? I always joke, it's one of the worst business models to write fiction books, but what inspired you to take the fictional route with this and not do, yeah, like a nonfiction kind of professorial, take on the AI on what could happen? Why did fiction feel
Well,
like
I've
your right
been well
vehicle?
practiced in unproductive business models for most of my life, being an educator.
Yes, yes, yes.
What one point, AI is either going to be the death of the humanities or the rebirth of the humanities, right?
Yeah.
So it's either going to call us back to depth and consideration and what it means to be a human being as a counterpoint to all this sort of synthetic technology. And of course, the humanoid robots are right around the corner too. So, the army of robots that we already see in all the social media memes
Yeah.
that are being produced in China of these robots being AI driven and being able to be conversational and relational with us. So, what drew me to fiction? I think I've been writing my entire life. So, uh, as a historian, as a student of philosophy and religion, as an essayist, as an attorney, as an educator. I'm writing every single day. So, in terms of, and I have written a collection of essays, the On Life and Meaning book that I did, where I wrote an essay inspired by each one of my guests and collected them into a book. So a day doesn't go by that I'm not composing something. I'm also an inveterate reader, so there's always two or three books on my uh, bed uh, beside me that it either goes a few pages read or the entire book gets consumed. And I grew up in a household that valued stories, so um, this isn't a new venture for me. Uh, what's new is the form. So a couple of years ago, in anticipation of wanting to be a more serious writer at this stage of my life and my own legacy projects, my own immortality projects, if you will, I joined a community of writers called Authors Lab, which is a program of a organization in Charlotte called the Charlotte Center for Literary Arts, or Charlotte Lit. And so I've been meeting with these writers for the last 2 years. We do intensives every other month, and then meet online. And everyone is working on a novel, a memoir, a work of nonfiction, and we've all been inspired by each other's work. And there's also a lot of craft instruction. And so story beats and narrative arcs and character development and conflict and resolution and so forth, and dialogue, all the things that are part of the craft. So I've been immersed in that work. And and I think given everything that we've talked about, given this interest in composition, it was just sort of a natural thing to want to write a novel. The larger question is, once I had the manuscript in hand, what was the decision around publication? And and so both the memoir and the book are self-published under my own imprint. Uh, Creative control, speed, pace, all of those things allow me to bring it into the world. There are trade-offs, of course,
Right.
because you don't have a publishing company getting it into every bookstore. You have to, you're carrying the lift on your own. But I'm comfortable with that. I've always
Right.
been entrepreneurial in terms of the the nonprofit work that I've done, but also just in terms of my creative life. So um, it's also, I don't know of any more important question facing us right now. So there's the politics of the moment. There's
Right.
the nation state conflicts that are always in the news. But how are we going to define the first quarter of the 21st century? What are we going to look back on as to say what are the defining macro uh, developments of this age? It's got to be artificial intelligence.
Right.
We've introduced something new into the world that potentially displaces our place in the world. And we're going to have to figure out a way on a global basis across boundaries to deal with this and to make use of it um, in a way that serves us and allows us uh, to flourish. And Elon Musk said we have what was his phrase? Um, uh, we have summoned the demon. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
in every horror movie, you summon the demon, and so this is either going to be a demon or an angel on our shoulder. It'll be both, of course.
Right.
It won't be one or the other, but it is consequential. And so I think that art is going to do what art does, which is to explore these deep existential concerns in the form of story, in the form of narrative, and it'll take different forms. And so it's already, obviously AI has first been introduced into language models, but now it's in music, it's in the performative arts, it's in every human expression. And I think good art and good literature is going to uh, deal with this, just like literature um, of the 19th century dealt with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. And I'm fascinated by that too, in terms of the romantics and stuff, the kind of the artistic reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the kind of breaking up of city villages into these big industrialized cities. But your book was described as part elegy, and I just wanted to ask you, what do you think is the book elegizing in that way? Is it that kind of humanity thing that there are kind of the old ways of creation, making art? I
It's
don't
so
know.
funny when we think of the old ways, where what are we talking about? 2018,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah,
2020.
yeah,
We're talking 5 years ago is
yeah.
the breaking point between the old ways and the new ways. I mean, AI has been with us since the 1950s in one way or another, right? With Alan Turing posing the question about what does it mean for a computer to think, right? And it's taken about 75 years for all of that to play itself out. In fact, I gave a presentation um, here locally in Charlotte called "The Human AI Future," and I did a retrospective on the development of AI from the 1950s forward, um, and and most of the people in their room were elderly. So this was a group of sort of senior scholars, retired professors, and so forth. And they certainly had a sense of perspective, beginning with the atomic age and everything that sort of presented. And do we deal with AI with the same kind of accord, if you will, to borrow the title of my book, as we did in terms of nuclear proliferation?
Right.
So, who would have thought in 1945 that the planet would still be here today and that
Right.
we'd never have an exchange of a nuclear weapon in anger since 1945, right? I mean, who would have thought that? Not that it couldn't happen tomorrow,
Right. Yeah.
but we're going to have to deal fundamentally with all of the. I mean, it's a race to the bottom in some ways because the economic incentives are to gain as much market share as possible, and so we're using AI not simply to um, change business models. Uh, we're using it to uh, gain as much folks in front of screens as possible. So we're going to put Facebook and TikTok, and all of these social media platforms, and we're going to put them on AI steroids. So um, we're, you know, all of that is worth talking about,
Yeah.
Andrew.
That's all coming too. Yeah. So it is interesting in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, elegy is a great art form in terms of that too. Some of the most famous poems and stuff that I'm thinking of. And this is a question that always comes up on the podcast because I think you're right. We were saying, oh, it's only, 5 years ago. We're talking about the old ways. Everybody feels that. I think there's a pre-online, pre-AI world, and now there is a post-online, like AI world where there is a divide. And it is a stark kind of divide where everything goes through the internet. Everything goes through mostly these social media platforms. I like to call them cheekily addiction softwares. That's what they were developed as, to addict you to them. But and I was thinking of like these companies, like they have Tristan Harris is this guy who goes around he's a product ethicist at Google. Product ethicist. That's a crazy title, right, for a big software company like that. But like that's basically what he was doing at that. Like he talks about how technology is not neutral. We imbue technology with these things, and it's what do we want this technology to do? And those are very serious questions that should be discussed at length, very seriously. And it should be about more than just, yeah, the economic bottom line. It should be about more than that too, especially when you think about something that has the potential to be so life-changing, so revolutionary as this artificial intelligence software is right now. And I know everybody says this, we're at the very early stages of this too. By the time I'm, 20 years from now, maybe my 50s, it could be looking a lot different. And it could be doing everything for us in terms of some of this stuff. So it's just interesting how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, technology is definitely not neutral. We often say it's simply a tool.
Right.
It's there, and it's how we use it. So that's sort of the cliched catch response. But in fact, Shannon Ballard, this philosopher of technology I reference, talks about techno-social and techno-moral values, and
Interesting.
that
Yeah.
every new technology reorders society, and every new technology gives us a set of new moral dilemmas. Uh, and for example, imagine a world where you and I are having a dispute over at a coffee shop. There's the world uh, where a gun exists and a world where a gun does not exist, right? If we put a gun in the middle of the table between us, the gun is not neutral because the
Right.
gun essentially creates a set of decision points that didn't pre-exist. So the mere introduction of the technology reorders um, the set of choices and the consequences of those choices.
Right.
There's the world before an atomic bomb, and then there's the world after the atomic bomb, right? So every new there's the world before the automobile and the world
Right.
after the automobile. So just think about when automobiles were introduced. Just within 10 years, we had to create roads and bridges and highways, and that had vast environmental impacts, literally changed the surface of the planet as we know it with the introduction of that technology. That has profound moral implications in terms of our environmental obligations, duties, our relationships with non-human species, how we built communities. Everything has changed, right, with the introduction of that technology. We have suburbia, we have houses, all of which are the result of being able to have um, the vast kind of transportation systems that comes with having an automobile. So there's always a social impact to technology and a moral impact to technology. So that's worth exploring when we start talking about artificial intelligence, because literally how we govern um, and how we fulfill our needs and desires, what the uh, economic and political incentives are, um, all of which will change as we introduce this new synthetic intelligence into the world.
Yeah, there's a poet I like named Rodney Jones, Alabama guy, and he's a little older now, but he wrote this poem probably around 2015-ish, 2014-ish. It's called Elegy for the Southern Drawl. And it was something that I started thinking about when I was reading that and just kind of the way social media and technology has even changed the kind of regional things, right? Like uh, before social media, you could go to a different part of the country, even in America here, and it would be a completely different culture. People talked different. The accents were very thick, right? And that's kind of going away, maybe because of this technology that's come in and we're hearing more dialects from all over the world and stuff, and you kind of lose the regional dialect. And there is this sense that I think people do have this sense when a new technology is introduced of loss, like we're losing something that we found special about ourselves or our city or our region or, whatever it is, something like that. You're talking about the more the social consequences of introducing a new technology. And it is something that I think is coming up and it's getting discussed more, but it still really isn't discussed how much even something like introducing social media and making that the dominant news and discussion platforms in the world globally, how much that has changed, the quality of the conversation, the seriousness of the conversation. Because now you have not just people that are doing this seriously, but then you have trolls, you have people that don't care. They're just doing something to get a reaction. Now that it's monetized, they're doing it to get money. It's just we haven't even really come to terms with how that has shifted, everything about our society and culture and people's reaction to it. The cancel campaigns, which aren't as big as they were even 5 years ago, but I mean, that was new because you couldn't cancel somebody in that way until that technology came in, where you could look up all this information and bombard the employer or whatever with emails or texts or whatever it is to get somebody fired or whatever it is. There's different variations of that. And just I wonder how long it's going to take us to deal with even something even bigger than that, like AI, coming into this.
Well,
And
it's
it's moving so
interesting.
fast now. Please, please.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you said elegy for the Southern drawl as opposed to the hillbilly elegy of J.D.
Oh, JD
Vance.
Vance, same thing,
Right.
kind of, right?
But
Same
but if
concept.
there
Yeah.
is an elegy here, if there is a loss, one thing to be mindful of is this sort of creative loop in terms of how um, uh, AI mimics us, but we begin to mimic AI.
Right.
So there comes to be sort of a standardization of how language is expressed because we're all using the platforms. And so, there are more M dashes in the world today than there's ever
Right.
been. And I see it, it's a tell, it's a giveaway. But that becomes sort of this I don't know what the right word for it, but there's this uh, um, there there's a loss of distinction as things become standardized
Right.
with this certain kind of AI expression where it's mimicking us and we're mimicking it, and it becomes derivative.
Right. Yeah, I think
So
then
that's something to be elegiac about.
yeah. Well, even Noam Chomsky has said, right now it's a plagiarism machine, is what a lot of these things
Yeah,
are, because they're scraping the internet, they're scraping the online digital kind of information ecosystem,
yeah,
and they're copying and pasting essentially. And again, not quite doing that. They're rewriting it in a way to put it all together. So, yeah, I get that point. I wonder how much that might change in the future if they're not going to be so much plagiarizing, if they could get to a point where they're are creating stuff. Although this gets, we're fascinated by this concept on the podcast. The je ne sais quoi, right? The kind of that little something, that intangible something. What makes one book better than another? What makes one poem better than another? What, all of these things that it has a quality that's very hard to grasp, very hard to talk about in a lot of ways. And we can talk about craft and break down the kind of structural elements of something that, gives us a thrill or whatever. And that's fun. I like doing that. I have a degree in that. But it's also like there's something else underneath of that. And I think this is where philosophy comes in, ethics come in, that kind of, as Harris would call the moral landscape, where this little fabric beneath the surface, these peaks and valleys of a landscape beneath the surface, there's high points and low points that we could kind of see through. I don't know. There's just this kind of thing underneath of it that is hard to talk about, hard to discuss, and hard to
yeah.
pinpoint even, these
So
little
recently
things.
in this writing community that I'm a part, we had a discussion about author's voice, the authorial voice,
Right.
and the authorial voice being our own individual way of thinking. It's the experiences, the way our brain processes, our perceptions, the way that we see the world, that all become part of our voice, separate and apart from the character's voice, right? It's the authorial voice. It's what makes Hemingway Hemingway and Andrew Andrew and Mark Mark, and
Right.
it's expressed in the questions that you asked and the way that your brain processes and jumps from one concept to another, and all the synaptic connections that is who you are, that becomes part of the creative process for you. And I think I think uh, how ultimately is our ethereal voice influence shaped in creative partnership with AI? And I think that's an interesting question too.
Yeah, absolutely. And this final question here, Mark, is one
Yeah.
thing I wanted to ask you about is, what would you say is the most urgent thing we should be focusing on in terms of AI and this new technology? And again, however you want to answer that. And I know you have a certain way in the book in terms of what is urgent, what should we be asking ourselves about this new tech? We talked about it a little bit already, but yeah, what would you say is the most important thing we should be focusing on that maybe we're not considering right now in this new technology?
Well, what jumped to mind, and I think with further thought, I might give you a different answer, but my immediate associative answer is we need to look at the economic incentives that are leading these companies to produce at the pace that they're producing at, without being able to pause to look at what are geopolitical conventions that we can enter into that provide some safety and security, um, and some, and looking at um, the underlying why um, behind the emergence of these technologies, and not simply sort of a race to market share. I think that's a very sort of a practical question. It's the question that Tristan Harris
Right.
asked when he, at the center of humane technology, is if we don't get a handle on the economic incentives, then all of these philosophical considerations that are really become beside the point.
Yeah. Back to trust, right? The point of all of this, right? This trust. It's a great word for it too. Do you trust that the person next to you is going to follow the rule of law? Kind of this, yeah, yeah.
Well, I
I
mean,
mean,
it's the fundamental issue in our politics right now, right? Behind polarization and
right.
division is who do we trust? And um, institutions,
Right.
political
Yeah.
institutions, social institutions are there to provide trust.
Right.
And if in fact we no longer trust the very institutions that undergird our society, then everything begins to collapse.
Yeah, if the truth-seeking institution is lying to you, it's it makes people very wary. Yeah, it's we're in a weird place with that too. It's crazy. That's a whole other discussion, Mark. I know. I know. But again, I don't mean to keep you this long, Mark. This has been fantastic here. Where can people find you? Websites, social media handles. Where do you want people to find your books, your work, your podcast?
Yeah, I would just have them go to my personal author website, which is markperes.com, markperes.com. So both books are posted and described, as well as my personal background and how people can acquire the books. And of course, that's what my hope is that folks order the books, read it thoroughly, review the books, share the books, all the good things that all authors hope for.
Of course. And that is all linked below as well, listeners. So go down there, click on it, buy the book. Mark, this has been fantastic. Please come back anytime.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great, and thanks so much for the questions and the journey you took us on.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
I may say male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources. American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom,
Heavy.
I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
see the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.
If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.